Suzette. Thank you
Hello.
so much for being here. All right, I would like to introduce Suzette Munley, volunteer speaker for Beyond Plastics, a nonprofit organization that works to end plastic pollution through education, advocacy, and policy change. Suzette Munley has been a restaurateur for over 20 years in Philadelphia. She serves as board secretary for PennFuture, working to transition Pennsylvania to a clean energy economy, and previously served as president of Center City Business Association. Suzette is a certified climate reality leader and Sierra Club Southeastern Pennsylvania Zero Waste group member. I've previewed Suzette's slides for this presentation, and wow, this is going to be an amazing educational experience. So sit back and prepare for an eye-opening journey through the issue of plastics. And Suzette, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, for the nice introduction, and I appreciate the invitation today. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate that you're choosing to attend today's talk to learn more about plastic pollution and how you can help create change. So first, I'll touch on Beyond Plastics. It's an environmental advocacy organization that seeks to end plastic pollution. And as a volunteer speaker, when I give an educational presentation, I anchor it on 4 pillars. And the first one is oceans. So the impact that plastic pollution has on our oceans and marine life, and the understanding that humanity won't survive without healthy oceans. The second is environmental justice, that plastic pollution is a growing global environmental crisis that disproportionately burdens people of color around the world in a variety of ways. The third is health, the impact to our health and what we are continuing to discover about this. And the fourth is the recycling myth. So the realization that we can't recycle our way out of this, and I know I feel duped about recycling plastic, and most people aren't aware of what's really happening and they think they're doing the right thing. So today I will touch on each one of these areas with a stronger focus on health and recycling and how you can get involved to create change. So let's take a look at how we got here and how plastic is made. So I'm going to pause for a moment of levity. Sometimes learning more about plastic pollution can be a bit overwhelming, and I know I can relate to the character in this cartoon who is grappling with her desire to be well-informed while also remaining sane. So thank you for being willing to learn more, and here we go. So to touch on a little history here, in the spring of 1970, Senator Nelson helped create Earth Day, and that was a way to force this issue onto the national agenda. 20 million Americans demonstrated across the country, and by December of the same year, Congress authorized the creation of the EPA, or the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So let's remember that we have a history of mobilizing to correct our mistakes, and now we also have a growing awareness about how our environmental laws and regulations are sometimes unjust or inadequate. So how did we get here? Well, one of the most amazing aspects of the plastic crisis is how recent it is. So of the nearly 10 billion tons of plastic in existence today, approximately half was manufactured in the last 18 years. So this crisis is happening in our lifetime. So let's look at a little bit of history. If we go back to World War II, many big corporations geared up to produce the materials that were to wage that war. So with metals, rubber, and silk in short supply, manufacturers turned to synthetics to replace them across an entire range of military supplies. So this is when the plastics industry came of age. So nylon replaced silk and parachutes, acrylic or plexiglass came into use for cockpit windows, and polystyrene and polyvinyl chloride were pressed into service in rain gear, boots, and helmets. But the plastic companies knew that once the war was over, they'd have to find peacetime markets. So even as early as 1942, Dow was advertising to consumers on the home front about the wonders of what we now call polystyrene. The industry bet on single-use plastic to secure its future by designing demand into the product, and they've been extremely successful. So the industry looked to grow not by moving plastic into people's homes, but through them. So promoting items that were disposable was almost as important to increasing market share as demonstrating that they were useful in the home. And since the 1950s, the production of plastic has grown exponentially, a 70-fold increase. And production is on track to triple again by 2060. And you'll hear me say that a few times today. So if we added up all the plastic the world has ever produced, we're looking at 10 billion tons, which is roughly 1 ton of plastic per living person on the planet. And we know plastic is ubiquitous, right? You can't avoid it in your daily life. Even if you're super careful about your consumer choices, you cannot avoid the packaging. So did you know that 42 to 44% of current plastic production is for packaging, like you see here? So the majority of what we're making isn't necessary. So how are plastics made? So many of you may know this. For those that don't, I'll touch on it briefly. So plastics are made from fossil fuels, and everything important you need to know about their creation and their impact stems from there. So today, almost all plastics are made from ethane, which is a byproduct of hydrofrac gas. And turning petroleum or ethane into a plastic fork or any plastic item won't just happen through temperature or pressure. It takes chemicals, and a lot of them. So additives are required to give plastics their stability, their color, and their flexibility. And plastics contain more than 16,000 chemicals. Over 4,200 are considered hazardous, meaning that they are known carcinogens, or they're known to disrupt brain development or hijack hormonal signals. You can see in the light blue area of the chart, 66% of the plasticizers, which is more than half, are entirely unstudied. So no one knows what they do to humans or whether they are safe. So here's a very important thing to remember. These chemicals are not bonded to the plastic molecule. They sit within it, and they leach out at every stage of the plastic's use and life cycle, including when they are used as food packaging or otherwise in contact with food. So plastics are highly linked to chemical exposure. PFOA is a lining in many food packages, like this microwavable popcorn. You may have heard about PFAS and PFOA in the spring of this year. It's also known as forever chemicals. So in April, the Biden-Harris administration issued the first ever national legally enforceable drinking water standard to protect communities from exposure to these harmful forever chemicals. Exposure to PFAS and PFOA have been linked to deadly cancers, impacts to the liver and heart, and immune and developmental damage to infants and children. So if you take away just one thing from this talk today, let it be this. Do not eat anything that is cooked or microwaved in plastic. When those molecules heat up, the chemical additives will migrate into the food. So we'll touch briefly on the process. So hydraulic fracturing or fracking is a process of pumping millions of gallons of water mixed with sand and chemicals deep underground to fracture the bedrock so the pockets of gas can be extracted. Ethane is a component of the natural gas that is extracted from fracking. Plastic production is one of the few viable uses for ethane. And we know that fracking sites release air, ground, and water pollution. Many of the 1,000+ chemicals used in fracking are harmful to human health, and some are known carcinogens. The ethane from a fracking well is piped to an ethane cracker plant like this one in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. It's a mile-long plant on the banks of the Ohio River. And here, the ethane is heated at really high temperatures, about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring massive amounts of energy. So this process is called cracking because the heat energy is used to break apart or crack molecules to form new molecules called ethylene, which is a main ingredient for single-use plastic packaging. And to touch on the economics, this plant that you see here received the largest subsidy ever in Pennsylvania, a $1.65 billion tax credit over 25 years. And in 2022, the global petrochemical subsidies were $7 trillion. That plant that you saw will process ethane from over 400 fracking sites. And that plant turns up to 120,000 barrels of fracked ethane per day into a petrochemical called ethylene, and then into polyethylene plastic pellets, or nurdles as they're called, which is used to make plastic. And most petrochemicals and plastic pellets in the US are made along the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, in areas like Louisiana's Cancer Alley. In fact, the petrochemical industry plans to triple plastic production by 2060. So currently, there are 206 permits for proposed new projects in Louisiana, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And if plastic were a country, it would be the world's 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter. So all of this is at a time when the climate crisis is making the front page news and affecting nearly every aspect of our lives. So as renewable energy becomes more affordable and widely used, and electric cars are adopted, the demand for fossil fuels is falling. But the current plastics market is now worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. So oil and gas companies are banking on the increase in plastic to make up for the falling demand for fossil fuels. So simply put, plastic is big oil's plan B, a fact that the industry openly acknowledges. So what about the people living in the areas where these processes occur? Well, the vast majority of people living in these communities are low income and/or people of color. The demographics with the least power to say, not in my backyard. So it's no coincidence that their neighborhoods are the chosen residents for petrochemical facilities. The health risk has become so prominent in frontline communities that the epicenter of plastic production in the US, which is located in Louisiana, has come to be called Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is a predominantly Black region of Louisiana that is home to massive industrial plants, and many of them petrochemical plants. This is the 85-mile stretch of 150 chemical plants and oil refineries. So the EPA estimates that the residents of this region have a 95% higher risk of cancer from air pollution than the rest of the country. So as a consequence of having their neighborhoods taken over by petrochemical facilities, the people living on the front lines and working in the facilities are at a much higher risk than the average person to develop illnesses. These range from respiratory conditions due to particulate matter entering the lungs, to slowed delivery of oxygen to vital organs, to new or worsened asthma symptoms, to reproductive system damage and birth defects, to cancer. And another thing to think about regarding the building blocks of plastic is that fossil fuels are highly flammable. So what is it that keeps our jackets and Legos and rain boots and carpets from bursting into flames? Well, those are flame retardants. And many of the chemicals in flame retardants are endocrine disruptors, which trick the body into thinking that they are hormones. So under normal circumstances, hormones carry messages and act like on-off switches. Common hormones are estrogen, testosterone, and the human growth hormone. And their presence in our bodies is like a dance that is very carefully timed. So endocrine disruptors upset this dance, even in very low doses, and they affect important systems all over the body. They can impact the hormones that regulate our appetite and metabolism, causing obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. They can disrupt brain development, causing lower IQ, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorders. And they can cause cancers, especially breast, prostate, and testicular cancers, all of which are on the uptick. This slide is from a Plastics and Health Symposium at NYU that I attended earlier this week, and it shows the projected increase in plastic chemical production. So Pete Myers is a doctor, founder, and chief scientist of the environmental health sciences, and he presented this slide with this comment, that it is unsurvivable to let chemicals raise according to this graph. You can see the X of where we are now and the hockey stick graph going up dramatically. And we know that plastic waste is also a global economic, environmental, and social issue. So in addition to the plastic pollution problems in the United States, the US, like many wealthier countries, is exporting plastic waste, often under the guise of recycling, to countries unable to safely manage it. So at the core of plastic pollution and climate disruption is the mistaken belief that the Earth's resources are infinite and that we have the right to use them for our benefit, even when the resulting harmful consequences are often directly borne by the lives and ecosystems of those who often have little or no voice or economic or political power. So for more than 2 decades, China was the dumping ground for foreign nations' trash. They were the world's largest importer of plastic waste. And then there was a dramatic change in 2018 when China enacted an import ban where they no longer accepted plastic waste from other countries. So now, as you can see on this graph, the United States is shipping more of our plastic waste to India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, places that do not have the infrastructure to manage it. You can see that last year we shipped 36,000 metric tons to India. And this is a picture of Chennai, India. So the US, one of the most developed countries in the world, utterly fails on recycling. So for the US, there's a problem of excess. A highly consumerist society fuels standards of commercial practice that are wildly unsustainable for the planet. You can see here, the United States is 4% of the world's population. We generate 12% of the world's solid waste, and we use 24% of the world's natural resources. This graph shows that we generate far more waste and recycle far less than any of the other developed countries that you see above us. In fact, if everyone lived like the US population, we would need 4 planets to make everything we consume. And we know that plastic doesn't go away or break down into the environment over time. It breaks apart into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics. So microplastics are particles smaller than 5 millimeters. It's about the size of a grain of sand. And they are the little bits of plastic that are everywhere. This microfiber is so small that it hitched a ride on a snowflake. Here's an insect covered in microplastics found in 2023. And in rain and snow, and as dust swept up by wind, microplastics are distributed to literally every portion of the earth. They have been found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, the deepest oceanic trench on Earth, and at the top of Mount Everest. So in one lifetime, humans have coated the planet with a fine layer of permanent microplastics. So you might wonder, where do the microplastics we ingest come from? Well, microplastics have been found in drinking water, much more so in single-use plastic water bottles. It's been found in beer, it's been found in honey, it's in fish, it's also in seafood, especially anything you eat whole, like mussels or shrimp, and it's in the air we breathe in. So existing estimates of human intake of microplastics are up to 211,000 particles per year. So this highlights the unavoidable nature of direct microplastic intake, no matter where you live. And this is a good visual of how microplastics travel up the food chain. So fish and smaller creatures consume tiny microplastics in our waterways and oceans. And when these fish, crustaceans, and seabirds are in turn consumed, the microplastics inside them keep traveling up the food chain until they reach us. And we are continuing to learn about the health impacts of plastic when it breaks apart into microplastics. So this is a groundbreaking report from 2020, and it showed the first evidence of microplastics in the human placenta. And then in 2021, a team of Italian scientists demonstrated that microplastics are crossing into the placenta and are present in the fetus at birth. In March of 22, we learned of plastic polymers discovered in human blood. In April of the same year, they were found lodged deep in the lungs of living people for the first time. In June of 22, they were also found in human breast milk. Then in March of 2023, the Minderoo Foundation brought together world-leading researchers from the fields of healthcare, the ocean, and the environment to launch the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. There were 48 authors of this report, and this monumental piece of research quantifies plastic's considerable risks to all life on Earth. The Commission's findings leave no room for doubt that current plastic production, use, and disposal patterns are not sustainable and are responsible for significant harm to human health, the environment, and the economy, as well as deep societal injustices. There have been quite a few studies published this year. This study people getting hip and knee replacements, and it identified microplastics in the cell membranes of every hip and knee joint studied. This study found microplastics and nanoplastics in artery plaque. And 2 studies were recently released that found micro and nanoplastics in the brain. So this was reported in it was an examination of the livers, kidneys, and brains of autopsy bodies and found that all contained microplastics. But the 91 brain samples contained on average about 10 to 20 times more than the other organs. And these results came as a shock, according to the study's lead author, who is Matthew Campen, a toxicologist and professor of pharmaceutical sciences at the University of New Mexico. So he's quoted as saying, "It's pretty alarming. There's much more plastic in our brains than I ever would have imagined or been comfortable with. The study describes the brain as one of the most plastic polluted tissues yet sampled." So we see parallel trends. Number one is the rising level of microplastics, and the second is the increasing global rates of age-corrected Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And the increased frequency of neurological disorders is no one's imagination. It is not an artifact of better diagnosis. An estimated 1 in 6 children in the US has a neurodevelopmental disorder of some sort, which is about 17% of all children. So turning now to our oceans briefly, about 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from the land. It's plastic litter. And that litter gets into streams and rivers, and then it enters the ocean. 8 to 15 million tons of plastic enter our oceans every year. So this is the equivalent of 2 garbage trucks every minute backing up to the shore and dumping its contents into the ocean. So we are, in essence, turning our oceans into unpermitted landfills. And we know the plastic will not break down. It is not biodegradable. Seabirds mistake colored plastic as food. And though the vast majority of plastics in the ocean has settled toward the ocean floor, there are millions of tons of bottles, bags, and other discarded materials, and they gyrate around the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, where the churn of the water and the glare of the sun accelerate the process of fragmentation. So as they weather, and particularly as they absorb UV rays, plastics release a variety of chemicals as well as measurable amounts of greenhouse gases. And just as a reminder of how important our oceans are, the graph on this slide shows the heat content in the ocean from 1955 to 2020. And you can see on the graph, the heat level is rapidly rising. We know that life is unsustainable without healthy oceans. They absorb 90% of the planet's excess heat, and they store 40 trillion tons of carbon. Oceans are the lungs of the planet. It gives life to everything. And we know that we cannot recycle our way out of this. So Americans discarded 51 million metric tons of plastic in 2021. Less than 6% of all plastic was recycled. Recycling of plastic has never, ever hit double digits. 85% of plastic waste in the United States is landfilled. An NPR investigative report found in 2020 that industry officials misled the public about the recyclability of plastic, even though their own report showed as early as the 1970s and 1980s that plastic could not be economically recycled. Industry documents show that starting in 1989, oil and plastic executives, they began a quiet campaign to lobby almost 40 states to mandate the chasing arrow symbol you see here, that it appear on all plastic, even if there was no way to economically recycle it. And at the time, some environmentalists also supported the symbol, thinking it would help separate plastic. But what it did was make all plastic look recyclable, and it's not. So in your own lives, you should only put number 1 and number 2 plastic in your recycling bin. The rest of them are not recycled. And that's because they are the only types of post-consumer plastic for which there are markets. A few communities may recycle number 5s, but not very many. So at a plant in Oregon, the bins are now full of trash the operator can't sell. Colleagues at recycling facilities all across the country report having the same problem. There is no market to sell them to. And plastic isn't actually recycled, it's downcycled into something of lesser value. So it's not like glass or aluminum, which can be made into equal value products over and over. It degrades each time it is reused, meaning it can't be reused more than once or twice. And speaking of plastic water bottles, let's remember, they aren't producing water. Over 1 trillion are purchased every day. So please ditch those plastic water bottles. And according to NASA, the past 10 years have been the warmest years since modern record keeping began in 1880. 2023 was the hottest year ever. We just finished the hottest decade ever recorded. And it is likely 2024 will become the hottest year on record. So we're going to touch really briefly on planetary boundaries. So these boundaries were coined in 2009 in Stockholm, and they are systems that have to be in check to survive. There are things like climate change, freshwater change, land system change. So you can see on this graph, 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries that track how close humanity is coming to environmental disaster have already been crossed by the end of 2023. You can see in 2009, 3 boundaries were crossed, 2015, 4 were crossed, and now 2023, 6 were crossed. And in July, scientists said there may be a 10th boundary. The oceans are running out of oxygen. So we're going to look at this one section briefly. This one boundary that's crossed, called novel entities, includes synthetic chemicals and plastics. So that green circle in the middle is the area of safe operating space. But look at novel entities and how far that has crossed the line. So we must act. And here's a visual. So this is how I want you to think about this. You walk into the bathroom, and your bathtub is overflowing with water. Do you start bailing out the tub, or do you turn off the tap? So what we need to do is turn the tap off on plastic production so we can get a handle on this issue. So how do we do that? Well, we turn off the tap by investing in clean energy, and we have solutions. Wind and solar are now cost competitive with fossil fuels. So we can get out of this mess with clean energy solutions. So the question is, are you in? I sure hope so. And there is some good news. I know this can be a little overwhelming and a little dark, but we already have the political will to achieve this. So people all over the planet are overwhelmed by the problem and they're looking for solutions. Polling that was conducted by Oceana in 2023 found that 79% of voters across the political spectrum are concerned about plastic pollution. And also 79% support state policies to reduce single-use plastic pollution. So this means that this is the time to organize, which is something that Beyond Plastics is very good at, and we would love your support and your help. We know that plastic bag bans so far have been highly successful. I personally work with 2 coalitions in my area, and so far we've passed over 35 local bans. And there are a lot of ways to get involved. So Beyond Plastics has over 125 affiliates across the country. You can find a local group near you, or you can create one with people in your community to help create change. Beyond Plastics' theory of change is to work at the local level. You start by banning plastic bags, banning polystyrene, and having plastic straws available only on request. And you start in your own life, and then you go up the ladder and eventually work at a state level. There is a federal bill, which was reintroduced in October of last year, called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And a few highlights of the bill: it would create a nationwide beverage container refund program. It would require producers of packaging, containers, and food service products to design, manage, and finance the waste collection and recycling programs. And it would also prohibit plastic waste from being shipped overseas to developing countries. So we really need support for this bill. So if you scan this code, or we will send you a link later in an email, it takes you to a page where you can find the phone numbers of your senators and state representatives. And it also gives you a script to use. So we would ask you to support and ask them to support the Break Free from Plastic bill. So we really need policy change to attack this problem. So we're looking for people to support these current policies. The first one is the UN Global Plastics Treaty. So it's about to enter its 5th session, which is called INC 5. And that stands for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. And they are developing an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And it's coming up in November. And this link would take you to a page to sign on to urge the United States to make a strong commitment to the treaty. The second one is legislation that was introduced to require new washing machines to be built with filters to catch those microplastic fibers from clothing. And the third is a letter to sign to ask the Department of Energy to reject a $182 million loan from the Inflation Reduction Act to support a project in Pennsylvania that will burn plastic. What can you do locally? You can install in your communities enough water refill stations so people can use reusable water bottles. You can switch out plastic bottles of water to boxed or aluminum bottles. So we know that aluminum bottles and cans are turned back into aluminum bottles and cans, so they support a circular closed loop manufacturing. And you can switch to reusables wherever possible, including takeout containers. And I've seen a variety of companies using polypropylene, which is those number 5 plastic containers, and marketing that you can heat your food up in them in the microwave. I would caution you on that. And you can also start in the kitchen. So anything that comes within contact of food, you can use non-toxic cookware and glass food storage containers. So there are a lot of nonstick pans that contain PFAS. So you want to look for cookware that does not contain forever chemicals. You can also sign up for Beyond Plastics mailing list. It'll keep you up to speed on new developments, events, and actions. For those of you interested in learning more, here are some great books that give you a wealth of information about this growing problem. There's also 2 great newsletters from the Environmental Health News. One is called Above the Fold, and one is a plastic pollution newsletter, which is full of information. And that is the presentation.